In this clip, we're going to learn light baking techniques. So light baking can be used to optimize your scenes. Whenever you have scenes that are full of real-time lights, or also known as dynamic lights, these lights are constantly checking and casting shadows across objects in the scene. Now, if your scene is not full of dynamic objects and there's no need to cast those types of shadows, it's important that you think about using light baking. Now, light baking is a process that takes the lighting information and bakes it down into a light map, which is then applied to the environment as a whole. The reason that you would want to use light map baking is so that way you can optimize your scenes. So right now we've optimized our lights and we've set some of them to important and not important. And what I want to do now is I want to optimize it even more. At this point, we would have to determine what lights can be static and what lights are not going to change no matter what, and what lights are not necessary to cast shadows. So what we could do is we could select these ambient lights that we created, and we could simply select them and tell them that they are going to bake their lighting information into a light map. So in order to do that, we need to set the mode of the light in the light component. So here you can see the mode. If we hit this drop down, you'll see that we have 3 different modes to use. We have real-time, mixed, and baked. Real-time is the most expensive light mode that you can use. Real-time is constantly checking to see if an object is casting a shadow, if it should be lighting another object at a per pixel level, and it is waiting to be turned on and off and to be interacted with constantly through script. And all of that can give you a little bit of a performance hit, especially if you have hundreds of lights in your scene and they're all real time. It's important to know that just because an object is not real time, that your game experience is going to be any less. If you do this right and mix your light types and light modes together, you can create an experience that is virtually unnoticeable. So with these ambient lights on the background, it would make sense to go ahead and switch them to a baked mode. Now, baked is going to take that color information, that lighting information, and bake it into a light map. And so let's go ahead and switch that to baked. Now you'll notice that everything has turned off. Everything is black at this point. The reason for that is because whenever lights need to bake down, the objects that they're going to bake their lighting information into must be static. So looking really quickly, let's turn off our lights and just look at our meshes. If we were to select the terrain object, you'll see that we have turned off static. And what this means is that this object could change. We could modify it to some script that modifies a parameter in it. Perhaps it changes the color or something like that. I don't even know if you could actually do that with a terrain, but with scripts, I think almost anything is possible. So what we want to tell Unity is that this particular object is not going to change. And so you can go ahead and bake your lights into this and we'll be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and just set this to static. Now if I go back to my lighting mode and we wait for this light to bake out, what we're going to see is that blue and pink information come back to just the terrain itself. So by default, Unity uses the auto-generate feature for the light baking process. So that little bar that we saw at the bottom was the auto-generating of the light map working. You can go to your lighting settings and you can turn that on and off. So if you don't want it to auto-generate, you can simply uncheck that, and then you would have to come in and say generate lighting every time. So here you can see that the light has projected itself and baked into just the terrain. But now what we need to do is we need to include all of the other objects to be static. So the way that we go about doing that is just going to the inspector, and we come in and we select the lot or the objects that we know are going to be static. I wouldn't include the battle dummy because we would think that there's some sort of interaction happening with that. So if we hit it a number of times, it could be destroyed. And so I would say let's not include that because it is a dynamic object. But the rest of these are just part of the environment, and we don't expect them to change. So let's not include the terrain on that, but I'm going to select all these rocks, the ferns, all these trees, and I'm just going down the list here. Now it would probably be a lot easier if we could actually put those into maybe a game object called environment, and we could change it all at the same time. But now we have all of these objects. Let's go ahead and switch them to static, and here it's going to say, do you want to change all of the children? Remember that some of these objects are nested and there are objects within objects, and we're going to say yes, change the children too. So now we're going to see that go through the baking process again, because Unity is recognizing that something in the scene has changed, either by position or rotation. Maybe a lighting value has changed somewhere. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and rebake everything to give you the most up-to-date version of your light map. So let's go ahead and wait for that to finish, and we'll see what happens after this. So here we can see that the baked lighting has come in. And so looking at it, things are a little washed out, and we might need to tone some of the lights down a bit. Now, let's talk about what is actually happening whenever we bake lights in. So what's happening is that the lights that are set to baked, they are casting their light, and each point or ray that comes out of the light touches a surface, and then it's going to bounce one time based on the indirect multiplier. And so when it bounces, it's transferring color data to another object. And so this is where we can start to get some really nice shadows, and we can start to see things like ambient occlusion and the indirect lighting itself. Whenever you're using baked lighting, you do have to start tweaking some things. So even with these lights that we have, they're set to baked, and something is a little off even if it is a little washed out. And what you're going to notice is that there are no shadows with these objects. And so what we would need to do is come in and select those one more time, and let's turn their shadows on and allow that to bake again. So let's switch this to, we could do hard shadows, but it would probably be better if we did soft shadows. So now what we're going to see is this is going to go through the baking process again. Now typically whenever it has gone through the baking process once, it shouldn't take quite as long on the second bake if there hasn't been a whole lot has changed. Now in this case we do have shadows that are being implemented into this, and so it might take just about the same amount of time, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to wait for that. Now immediately we can see some definite changes. We're starting to see these shadows in areas that make a lot more sense, and things are looking pretty good. So we could come in and we could start to make those subtle changes to these assets. We could start to maybe dial in the intensity a little bit, maybe change some positionings of the lights. But I think we're pretty good. I'd like the blue lights to be just a little bit darker. They appear to be really, really bright at this time. And so what I'm going to do is I like the overall consistency of the pink lights in this way. So let's go ahead and just dial down the blue lights. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take that intensity down, and it automatically you're going to see this starting to bake those in. So let's go ahead and do something, maybe let's just do 2 just to get started with it, and we'll allow that to bake out. Okay, so at this point things are starting to look a little bit better. We're still getting a lot of even this information in there, like the it's really kind of turning everything kind of a light purple, and we're starting to get away from what I'm really anticipating and really wanting here. So let's do the same thing for these lights. Let's go ahead and take their intensity down even further. So let's do something like 1.5 on these, and let's do 1.5, not 15. That would be crazy. So again, we can continue to tweak this and modify the values, but hopefully you're understanding how these baked lights work. Now, there's one more mode that we skipped over, and I skipped over it purposefully because what mixed lighting does is it actually mixes the two between baked lights and dynamic lights. Now, you might be wondering, why wouldn't we just use that all the time? That sounds awesome. The advantage of using mixed lights is that it does give us that baked lighting information. However, it will allow us to cast shadows on dynamic objects, but we can really only change a couple of things about the light itself. We can only change the color and the intensity through a script. So let's say, for example, that we wanted these lights to have some sort of flicker. We would either have to choose a real-time light or a mixed light to do that. And so what I would say with these is, if there's no reason to have it as real time, if we're not going to turn them on or off, then let's just use a mixed light. Now, for these, we could very easily create a system that would allow the player to light the lantern or to extinguish it. And so that would be the reason we would use real time. So with these, I plan on just leaving them on, but I would like to create some sort of animation that would allow these lights to flicker. And so what I can do now is just simply switch this over to mixed, and then we'll see these lights bake their information down into the environment, but then it would give us the things that we would need to change the intensity through some sort of animation. So I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to allow this to bake out so that way you can see the result of all of these lights, and then we'll move on into our next clip. Now that we've baked these lights out, you can see the final result that we have. So everything is looking good. We've optimized our lights. We've also baked everything down, and this particular environment should be very light as far as lighting is concerned. So now that we've talked about light baking techniques, let's move on to our next clip.